My name is Alison McFarlane. I'm a professor here at the University of British Columbia. I'm also the director of the School of Public Policy and Global Affairs, which houses the Lind Initiative, which is why you're all here this evening. But before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge that UBC is on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded lands of the Musqueam peoples, and I would like to pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and future. And since many of you are also joining us from online, I'd invite you to reflect on the Indigenous lands that you are joining us from this evening. A warm welcome to all of you to our second event in the 2023 Phil Lind Initiative Speaker Series, Uncivil Discourse. We're exploring this spring the intersections of language and political polarization in the United States. Through this series, we seek to raise questions as to if and how a civil culture can be reimagined in our current era. While our guests throughout this series will speak to the American experience, Canada and Canadians are not immune to these forces, as we well know. We too must ask how to sustain respectful, honest, deep conversations if we're to address substantive challenges facing democratic societies. We had the privilege of beginning the discussion last month with award-winning journalist Masha Gessen, who not only urged us to think of politics as the art of living together in a particular space, but also emphasized the importance of practicing this at the local level. Tonight, I'm very excited that we get to continue the conversation. Before I introduce the moderator and tonight's keynote speaker, however, I want to acknowledge that we're able to gather here tonight basically because of the generosity of UBC alumnus Phil Lind, who's made not only this event, but all our previous programming possible. We can't thank Mr. Lind enough for giving us the opportunity to bring such esteemed guests to UBC year after year to address our students, staff, faculty, and the broader community. So Phil, on behalf of myself as director of SPPGA, the Lind Initiative staff, the students, and the extended UBC community, we thank you for your contribution. So, on a logistical note, please feel free to tweet along with this event using the hashtag Lind23. There you see it up there. We'll be taking audience questions in the latter part of the event through Slido. So simply visit slido.com on your phones or on your computers with the code hashtag LindSlido. And that's there, you can see it there. Please feel free to submit your questions or to upvote a question you'd like to hear asked, but please no comments. Our moderator this evening, whom you'll be meeting shortly, is Celina Caesar-Chavannes, author, adjunct lecturer at Queen's University, and former member of Parliament and parliamentary secretary. Celina is a critically acclaimed thought leader. I'm delighted to be able to welcome Celina to join us here as part of the Lind Initiative. And I'd like now to introduce our keynote speaker for tonight, Dr. John McWhorter. Professor McWhorter teaches linguistics at Columbia University in New York and specializes in language change and language contact. He's written extensively on issues related to linguistics, race, and other topics for a variety of outlets, including Time, CNN, The Wall Street Journal, The New Republic, and The Atlantic, where he was a contributing editor. You may know him from his regular column in the New York Times, which focuses on how race and language shape politics and culture. A prolific author, Dr. McWhorter has written more than 20 books, including the New York Times bestsellers, 9 Nasty Words, and Woke Racism. In addition, he hosts the Lexicon Valley Language podcast and writes a twice-weekly newsletter for the New York Times. I am thrilled to welcome Dr. John McWhorter to UBC, and I'm going to turn the spotlight over to him now. Let's welcome him.
Thank you, folks. Allison, thank you, and thank you, UBC, for having me here. It is lovely to be back in Vancouver. And I don't want to take up too much time just talking alone, but I want to introduce you, or for some of you maybe review, what my take on this issue is of how we can talk across divides more effectively. I think that the news is not always as good as we might think. I have to be honest about that. But nevertheless, I hope what I have to say is constructive, because of course, we must get ahead of where we are now. This is the issue. I think that we're often told that what our problem is that a certain kind of person, especially over the past 3 years, but really we started talking about this in the United States at least a lot about 10 years ago. The idea is that a certain contingent of people overrepresented in academia don't understand the nature of free speech. They don't understand that we ought to be able to discuss pretty much any topic and see where the chips fall. That's not what's going on here. And the reason that I want to stress that is because if we think of it in that way, as clean and abstract as the term free speech is, and as familiar with it as we are, I don't think we're going to be able to get past what the problem is. It's not about certain people mysteriously thinking that free speech is not important. There's a specific topic involved, and that is this. Especially since 2020. And the racial reckoning in the United States and its effects, which spread with remarkable rapidity beyond the United States. Since then, but among a certain contingent even before, there is a certain commitment that can sound both normal and rather abstract at the same time, especially because it's rarely stated explicitly, and therefore we have to zero in what it is. That idea is that what we must hold front and center in all of our intellectual and our artistic endeavor, as well as our sense of what justice is on all levels, what we have to hold front and center is battling power differentials, and specifically the power of whiteness. The idea is that that's not just one of many things one might think about. You might imagine a humanist in, say, 1998. That was something that they were concerned about. But we've had a certain kind of development where the idea that you must battle the power of whiteness is supposed to center everything. Now, by center everything, what I mean is that if you're engaged in some sort of intellectual or artistic activity that doesn't center that does not assume certain tenets of that as sacrosanct, so to speak, then you're doing something wrong, you're doing something immoral. And the idea is that that's not a proposition, but that's a fact. If you aren't battling power differentials, and especially ones involving whiteness, you're sinning, is the idea. Now, that's different from someone deciding that we shouldn't have free speech, because, frankly, none of us are really as in love with completely free speech as we would like to think. How many of us are really interested in having extended discussions about whether or not there should be slavery, or whether or not there should be genocide, or whether it is really sensible that women have the vote? Free speech? Not really. None of us want to speak freely about any of those things. The idea is what you consider beyond free speech. And the idea is that we have discovered that if we don't hold battling whiteness at the center of things, then we are sinning in the same way as most of us would consider it to be sinning, if I may use that word, if we were to espouse pedophilia. And I don't mean that for effect. I mean that the kind of person who we're trained to think of as needing a tutorial on free speech is someone who thinks that if you're not battling whiteness, and make no mistake, I'm talking about people who often are white themselves. If you're not battling whiteness, then you are as much out of court as someone who is espousing pedophilia. There's no question. So the idea is that we will not speak freely about the matter of battling power differentials. To people like this, that's not one of 8 things you think about. It's the thing. And it creates the kind of dispute that I wrote about in my book, Woke Racism, that I've thought a lot about over the past several years. And the problem is that what these people think of as the answer to everything, and they think of it as the answer to everything with a great benevolent intent. There's nothing evil, there's nothing manipulative about any of this, but what these people think of as the answer to everything creates many more problems than it does help any people. There's some terrible things about this view that battling whiteness must center everything. So, for example, the idea behind it is that it constitutes a quest for social justice, as it's called. Notice how powerful those 2 words have become, social justice. In the United States, specifically, the idea is that it helps black people. But the truth is, that's an under-examined notion. The current idea of what anti-racism is, coming from a lot of particularly popular writers over the past 3 to 10 years, that view of anti-racism as one that must center everything that we do and think on the pain of people being censored and sanctioned, is not proven. And so, for example, why is it that we're being told that for Black America to truly overcome, that white America needs to undergo a massive psychosocial revolution, a complete change in the way white people think in ways that they're not even consciously aware of? Now, it's one thing to undo actual segregation and disenfranchisement in the 1960s, and it's another thing, something else that doesn't have a name and so it's harder to discuss. It's another thing in the 1970s and 80s when white America learned to examine itself for inner racism. So it's not about signs on water fountains or something, but are you a bigot and don't you want to fix it? When I was a child and a teenager, that's what non-Black America was working on, and massive progress was made on that. Okay, so if a people are going to get ahead, of course we're going to say get rid of segregation and disenfranchisement, although all groups have not even had the advantage of that happening. The Civil Rights Revolution was truly revolutionary in human history, but thank God it happened. Then maybe what black people needed was for white people to feel very guilty about being racist and to think twice about their racism. Maybe that was needed. I think of it more as a lucky break, but it certainly helped some things. But what we're being taught to do now, such as conceiving of all differentials between groups when one of the groups is white as based on racism and therefore called something like racism or structural racism or institutional racism, that must always be the reason. Any kind of disparity is racism. Is that necessary for a group to get ahead? I'm not sure that that's been proven. I know that it feels good for a certain kind of person to say those sorts of things, but does it really help anyone? What is the direct relationship? Under-argued. Another problem with the new paradigm is that it's one with a tacit sense, baked in, that if someone runs afoul, then they deserve to have their lives destroyed, or at least screamed at, made to feel like fools on social media. And I hate to say that I've seen advocates of this kind of view openly say that people deserve to be shamed, put in the stocks, made to cry, because they've gone against this tenet. Now, notice, people deserve to be shamed, put in the stocks, made to cry for being pedophiles. Yeah, I can kind of go with that, yeah. But for these people, this social justice matter is the same thing. And the problem is that I think in terms of what a real social justice would be, most of us would think that the idea that you would lustily make someone cry, make them look bad on Twitter, watch them defenestrated, ejected from a job for no real reason, we assume that that's going to be in extreme circumstances. There's not going to be any paradigm that assumes that that's something that you do to people on a regular basis. That's the Cultural Revolution. That's Stalin, of course, in a quieter way, but nevertheless the principles are the same. one doesn't bring into a university, into a world of the arts, into law schools, a paradigm that sanctions people's lives being destroyed for petty torts. It won't do. And yet, this new anti-racism is very much based on an idea that you must watch people's lives destroyed with joy on a regular basis, and that somehow it's different from the Cultural Revolution. Really, it isn't in principle. And then the third thing that really worries me about the new anti-racism is how condescending it is to black people, for example, because something else baked into it is that if white people are more represented in some field, then in order to have social justice as quickly as possible, the idea seems to be that we have to have this justice quite instantly, that's the new thing, is that you have to change standards. And so we have to question what we think of as norms, we have to question what we think of as substance, we have to question what we think of as excellence. Now, do we to an extent? Sure. So 125 years ago, it was considered part of a real education to study ancient Greek. Why? You read about people back then and they knew their ancient Greek, and you think, couldn't they have known something else? And nothing against ancient Greek, I'm a linguist, I like ancient Greek, but why did everybody have to know? Well, gradually people let go of that, sure. Tests are not perfectly constructed, sure. But we have an epidemic, I hate to use that word, but of questioning standards of that way these days. And too often we're told to celebrate something as excellent just because a black person produced it, rather than because a black person produced something excellent. And frankly, we do that all the time. But the notion lately is that just our having produced something makes it excellent. I don't like it. It's a pat on the head. Too often in the United States, black people are told that they're doing very, very, very well, when actually there are other black people who are doing very, very well, but that particular black person didn't necessarily. They just showed up and beat black. No, that's what this new anti-racism is, and it won't do. Now, the important thing about this new way of looking at things is that there is nothing evil going on. I do not believe that there are white anti-racists going about enjoying destroying people's lives. I do not believe that there are black anti-racists who are enjoying making a noise, enjoying making people uncomfortable, and making a certain amount of money based on being placed in positions. It's nothing like that. I've met no one like that. What we're dealing with is something which, I don't know if you would have been able to predict it about 4 years ago, but it's something that makes perfect sense if you think of the perfect storms that create social historical change. It really all makes a lot of sense. But that doesn't mean that it isn't seriously wrong. And so, for example, the white anti-racist who's leading a mob on Twitter against someone for nothing that they did, and watching this and thinking of it as social justice, that's a product of a good thing, which is that being called a racist so deeply frightens, especially educated white and other non-black people today, that you feel that one of the most important things you want to do in the public square is show that you are not a racist. That's good. That wouldn't have been true in the United States in 1970 or 1980. It's a stretch in 1990. So it's an excrescence of something that's a good thing. That the way that you show that you're a good person is not by going to church on Sunday, for example, is not by making food baskets and handing them out to the poorer people in town, but to show that you are not a bigot inside to the point that you would make somebody cry if it, quote unquote, looked like they were. That makes sense. It's excess. There are always excess pendulum swings in history. A black anti-racist who, and I hate to say this, but frankly, it's real. A kind of black person exaggerates about racism. Not that racism doesn't exist, we all know that it does. But a large question, often asked by, for example, foreigners I've noticed who come and notice the race scene, is not, there's no racism, but they often ask, why are they exaggerating? Why do they sound like it's 50 years ago? We all know that that is an issue. I know that's hard to hear, especially coming from me, but I believe it's also true. Why the exaggeration? And that makes sense too. That comes from a human type. There's something that psychologists know. And I have seen very few of them actually take what they know and apply it to the American race debate, and I understand why. They have bigger fish to fry and they don't want to get mauled. But there is something called the victimization mindset. Notice I didn't say complex, mindset. It's something in people. It has nothing to do with just black people. There is a kind of human being, and there always has been, especially in modern societies, who ends up finding that victimhood, especially if their lives are actually relatively okay, that victimhood is the most interesting thing about them. That's a way that a human being might be. We've all known people like that. It's the way people might be. Black America ODs on that somewhat, and that's partly because of the battered history of our race, but it's partly because non-black America has become so receptive to it over the past 30 or 40 years. Now, nobody would have expected that, but history is always about pendulum swings. And so, if a human being is insecure in one way or another, and aren't we all, well, if you're white, you have various ways that you can deal with it. You might develop the victimization complex. It's easier to if you're a black person. And so, the black anti-racist who joins in these kind of mobbings, who engages in a kind of reasoning that doesn't seem to quite follow from A to B on issues of race, it's the victimization mindset, and that happens to people. And both what we're seeing with whites wanting to show that they're not racist and black people in the victimization complex, all of this is just modernity. And so, for example, if you're not living in a group of, say, 150 or 200 people, which many anthropologists say is how Homo sapiens began, and we don't want to overdo the evolutionary biology, but what we're hardwired for. Once you're beyond that, life gets confusing, and it can be hard to be an individual. That is so much of the theme of human history. If you live with 150 people, you're an aunt, you're a sister, you're a daughter, you're a grandmother, you're a friend, you know what you are. I'm told by anthropologists who study hunter-gatherer societies, at least 3 of them that I've asked, there's no such thing as a depressed person in small societies like that. Nobody loses a sense of who they are and goes off on a hill and looks off into the sunset. You know who you are all day long, every day. The further we get from that, the more we get into the possibility of what we might call ennui. Well, there are different kinds of ennui. And what are you? What makes you special? One thing that might make you special is that you are not a bigot. Your society sanctions that you show that in a charismatic way. What are you? You're a victim. What makes you interesting is that there's this hegemon that is hurting you and that makes it so that your life and your accomplishments count for more because you're always battling this victimhood. All of this is perfectly natural and modern, and then modernity ends up creating another problem, and that's why this has gone so crazy over the past 10 years, and then especially again 3. It's social media, it's Twitter. So it used to be that if you did something wrong, there might be a kerfuffle in the news. People would write letters to the editor, etc. But it was harder to destroy a reputation. Once you've got something like Twitter, where one push of a button and the entire world knows, and especially when you've got something called Twitter, where there's one push of a button and the entire world knows and everybody is stuck inside for a year and a half during a pandemic, next thing you know, you have a tool whereby these modern afflictions that people, both black and white, suffer from are magnified because people are even more afraid, because people can get the word out even more charismatically. All of this is the perfect storm that I'm referring to. You could have almost seen it coming with the invention of social media and it becoming default. Twitter and Facebook became default both in 2009. And then what would happen when everybody was locked up inside and interacting mostly on Slack and on Zoom? That's what created a lot of this, and now we're just living with the long tail of it in terms of the attitudes that it created. And so, no one is a monster here. These are natural things. This is the flaws of humanity. None of us are immune. But the question is, what do we do about it? To go back to our topic of how do you talk across the divide. It's not just about free speech, and the reason people are having trouble with it is because of psychological manifestations that are very deeply seated that become part of what people think of as the self. So it's not just formal arguments, debate team style. It's different kinds of selves trying to have a conversation about, as it were, I'm going to say this word one more time, as it were, pedophilia. You're trying to have a dialogue about pedophilia. How far is that going to go? How do you talk across that divide? That's the sort of thing that we're dealing with. And what it means is that, one, it's important to understand that no one is a monster. And one can master a kind of equipoise in being able to realize that even the person who's yelling at you, even the person who's saying and rolling their eyes and doing all those things with emojis, etc., that even that person is not a monster. They think they're doing good. They honestly do. And this goes for anything that one might feel as irritating by people of this sort. No one is a monster. But then on the other hand, and this is where I make myself unpopular in some circles, but I've got to be me. I could talk about how we can reach hands across the divide, and you could put some Aaron Copland music in the background. But I'm sorry, I wouldn't believe it. This is not that. We're dealing with something much trickier than that. And this is what I'm going to be unpopular in saying, but I truly believe that this is solutional. This is not confrontational. Non-Black America did a lot of work on itself in the 70s and 80s in looking to the inner racist. I think we're so used to that in North America to an extent. Obviously, I'm talking about the United States, but there are analogs to this in Canada as well. We're so used to thinking about it, not perfectly, that we forget how advanced we are compared to many places in the world. So not perfect, but the fact that we think about racism so much and that it is a big deal, that's something many people in other countries find peculiar about us, and I would rather be us. That's important. It's extremely important. Nevertheless, the problem is that when a kind of person wants to force us to not make sense, then a new kind of bravery is necessary, a new kind of girding the loins and walking forward into something uncertain is necessary. And this is regardless of color. The kind of person today who is what we might call hyper-woke, in my book, Woke Racism, I call them the elect. That's not really catching on, but well, let's call it the hyper-woke. Not just woke, by the way. I don't mean people who are on the left. I don't mean people who realize that there are systemic biases in the United States and in any other quote-unquote developed country. I don't mean just woke. I mean the hyper-woke. I mean the prosecutorial woke that make people's lives miserable. If that kind of person is not going to transform our societies, we need to learn how to tell that kind of person no. And that's not easy, because that kind of person, and I don't think they do this on purpose, but that kind of person, when they don't get what they want, call you a racist on Twitter. And that means that everybody sees you being called a racist or your organization. That's hard. I know that's hard. But we need to have a critical mass of people who can look someone like that in the eye, who's using that language, who's using that collection of about 11 words, who's calling you a racist, who's telling you that you're not in favor of social justice, and just saying, no, you can't have what you're asking for. You cannot transform our institution. You cannot transform our school curriculum. That's not the way we're going to make this movie. We are going to revive this play from 1931, and there are going to be a few lines that wouldn't work today, but because if we don't have those lines, the plot wouldn't work. We're going to have them in, and we're going to assume that the audience understands that there are differences in time periods. You can't have what you want. That kind of person needs to be stood down. And the reason is not because that kind of person deserves to be shown what for. Confrontation, as I said, is not the point. It's because if, at least in the United States, the metric continues to be that if a person says the words social justice and intersectionality and societal racism, et cetera, then they get shouted down and treated as evil people in public. If that's the way it's going to be, then those people get to run society, and it means that society will be based on the ills that I mentioned. And I don't think that'll do. And so, healing this divide partly will have to be a matter of, at a certain point, with a certain kind of person, being able to say, we're not going to agree. This discussion cannot continue. We'll have to move on. And I'm afraid that in order for us to have a just society, you're not going to be able to get what you want, and you're going to be rather unhappy. So will I, because of the tone of this discussion. But this is the way it has to be if we're going to go on in a constructive manner. That's hard, but I genuinely am not sure how you get across to someone of the kind of frame of mind I'm talking about that their views need to change, because they don't see themselves as having a view. Now, one thing that is worth trying is to say, we have differing priorities here. You are centering, battling white power amidst everything and thinking that everything else must fall aside in view of that. I feel that that's one of about 10 things we might think about, but I don't prioritize it as much as you, and that's not going to change. Some of the people like this might understand that. In my experience, they don't think of themselves as centering white power as everything. They don't imagine that that's a thing, as we put it. Fish don't know that they're wet. For them, that is just the way that it is. But if you tell them, our difference here is that you're centering that in a way that I'm not going to, maybe that will work with some, but to tell you the truth, in my experience, what most people of that persuasion will say is that, no, that means that you're a racist. If you don't prioritize it as much as me, then you are polluted. And there's really nowhere to go from there. And so what I'm advocating here is not battle, and it's not recreational disrespect, but it's a sense that in some cases, the divide can't be bridged, and that one needs to be able to civilly but constructively work around a certain kind of person and understand that sometimes coming together is impossible, but that the alternative is not that that kind of person gets what they want. That's the problem that we have here. If you don't tell them no, well, too often it means they just get what they want and the curriculum is turned upside down. But that won't do either. So, in conclusion, I think that we need to understand that sometimes when you look at a divide, the civilized, the even advanced way of looking at it might be that that's a divide that can't be bridged. And that's a depressing thing for me to say, and that's a depressing prospect, but honestly, if that isn't something that happens more often, I find that personally to be anti-black. Quite honestly, if someone proposes all differentials between white and black people are due to racism, and therefore that racism must be battled by changing our notion of what standards are, by a kind of redistributive justice. If someone says that, that's a proposition, but it's one that I'll bet every second person in this room understands is rather fragile and is an oversimplification of how social history works, even if it's about the descendants of African slaves. It's oversimplified. It's not politics. It offers no real solutions, or if it does offer solutions, they're not just, they're not fair. If somebody is working along the lines of that kind of proposition, and it's a common one, for us not to be able to say to that person, no, we don't think so. That is not a suitable analysis of this particular problem, and we're not going to use that as a solution. If that person can't be told that, we are not a mature society, and we have condescended to that person, and by extension to blackness, by implying that for black people, logic and reasoning, and therefore, frankly, intelligence, are something different than with all other people. So, the new anti-racism is not based on evil, it's not based on manipulation, and no one deserves to have their feelings hurt on purpose. But I think we need to realize that there's a frame of mind where I think the constructive and even enlightened view would have to be, we're just going to have to move on, and I'm sorry you're unhappy. That, frankly, is doing the work. I'm finished. Thank you.
Thank you very much to the audience that's here, to John, for a provocative beginning of this conversation. And I'm feeling that this type of discourse is necessary to start to bridge together what you're talking about in terms of a divide. And I just want to address some of the things that you said in your speech that I think need to be flushed out a little bit more. And you talked about addressing systemic racism in a way that centers whiteness and the problematic, or that being problematic. And when I think about that historically, from in the United States, you have, and my background's in science. People know me as a former politician, but my background is in neurological research and science. And when I think about the injustices that have happened in health and various disparities of health that further perpetuate the social construct of race in order to make a society more akin to whiteness, why would we not center whiteness or dismantling white supremacy as one of the major tenets of starting to move forward towards a just society?
That's such a perfect question, because I have the same goal that you do, because what you're talking about are real problems. What bothers me is the words that we use to describe those things. And so what I can't wrap my head around is, yes, these things that you're talking about have racially disparate impact, but I cannot comfortably, I actually officially stopped using the term 6 weeks ago, I cannot be comfortable calling that racism. Now, there has certainly been racism straight up in terms of the history of healthcare, et cetera. But in terms of the present day situation, for me to call the disparities racism implies that there aren't a lot of poor white people who are suffering from the same sorts of things. Or it implies that racism that happened in, say, 1955 has legacy effects now, but we're encouraged to still say it's racism and battle racism, when almost nobody involved today could be called racist in any real way. And so I want to fix the problem, but I'm uncomfortable calling it white supremacy as if we're going to have the same approach that Dr. King had. It's the words. And so to me, there's an inequity that's going on that impacts black people disproportionately. But the fact that too many black people died of COVID, I can't look at that and say racism. It's too abstract a use of the word, and I think it goes to the amygdala, however you pronounce that, in a way that distracts us from actually grappling with the problem. Does that make sense? Tell me where...
It does make a little bit of sense to me, but when we think about... It does make a little bit of sense, but we had this conversation earlier. But when we understand that there is a legacy of structural racism that exists in institutions, that you don't think that there's a
I don't know why we use that word. I know what you're talking about, but it's not, after a while, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but
no, because after a while,
it's not racism anymore.
Then
It's that something happened here in, say, 1950, and then you see legacies in 2023, and what you want is to fix people's problems here, but fixing the problems here isn't about fixing how white people feel. Yes, I know that there's studies that white people think black people don't feel pain, et cetera, but all of that nibbles at the edge of this problem. How do you get black people better health care? Thinking about it as discrimination, when really discrimination's root definition is how one person feels about another one, I just don't feel that. And I'm never going to interrupt again. I'm sorry.
No, I don't mind the interruption. I think this is a great way to have a conversation. I think we're going to have to agree to disagree on, and that's okay. That's the bridge.
The bridge, the divide.
The bridge that you
right.
said that was okay. So you also talked about centering white supremacy and not using that as a way to dismantle structural racism. And then went into a conversation about cancel culture. And I'm not sure that those two things are synonymous or close or related at all. And I think I could agree with you on the cancel culture part, that we shouldn't just fire someone for the glee of, them, one person saying something on Twitter and making that law or Bible, because that's happened to me in politics, where talking about one thing ends up having a mob after me over it. can we not then separate those two, saying that one is clearly something that needs to be dealt with in a different way, while still looking at structural issues that lead to disproportionate, disparate outcomes for, especially if we bring it to a Canadian context, Black and Indigenous people?
Here's an example. This came up today. Kids are taught to read wrong disproportionately in the United States if they are Black. Teaching via WIFTY, whole word, whole language methods is something disproportionately applied to Black kids as opposed to white kids. And so you could say it's structural racism. We need to battle the racism in the teaching of reading. My approach has always been talk about how phonics helps people to read better, and that it also has been shown to help both Black and white poor kids read better, and align reading teaching with the science. And that message, not from me, but that message seems to be getting around because it's true and because the media have picked up on it. Whereas I think a certain kind of person, and not you, but a certain kind of person would say, it's racist. Let's go battle that racism. Well, I didn't battle any racism. I just kind of shouted from the rooftops that phonics is better, and I said it disproportionately affects Black kids to not be taught with phonics. But calling it structural racism, I'm not sure would have helped. You know what I mean?
I do know what you mean, but if that is the vernacular, if that is the language that people are understanding, and that is the way by which we could start to see the historical evidence of a problem and the policy that was put forward to make that problem exist today, why wouldn't we continue to have that conversation? And why would we claim that and you used it in your speech, that Black people are ODing on this idea of racism? I don't necessarily think we're ODing on it. If we know that racism as it intersects with class and gender and other identities has a real way of disenfranchising people, and I understand what you're saying, we seem to be looking at the problem instead of a solution. Why wouldn't that be where we start from to have the conversation of fixing it?
You have hit upon the nut of what I think our disagreement is going to be.
Okay.
Most human beings are not and will never be historians. I know what you mean about how we have to talk about how we got here from there before we solve the problem, but that's just it. I don't know that we have to talk about how we got from here to there to solve the problem. I think that rather we are taught that our job is to show white America that it's not our fault. So it's not that we're dumb, it's that the schools were like this and like this and like this, all of which is probably true. It's not that we're this, it's that there was all of this history. And we might disagree on this, I don't give a good whether white people know that it's our fault or not. I've never understood that. I didn't get that when I was 10. As far as I'm concerned, here in the present, we show that we're good enough. I don't want to talk about the past because, frankly, most people aren't going to see it that way. And I'm not afraid that we're not good enough. So that's why. Why do we always have to talk about 1940? And I don't mean the kind of person who says, why do you always got to stir that stuff up? I don't mean that. I mean, why do we need to give everybody these history lessons? It's not our fault. I just want to show them what we can do now. It isn't our fault. But why must we teach people that all the time outside of academia? Do you see what I mean?
I do see what you mean, and I think we could come to some common ground on that, because if the discourse is constantly centered around, and this is what I'm believing you're saying, bringing people up to speed on, redlining in 1933,
Exactly.
and then 1964, you got rid of it, but then there's a history of that. Let's start from the present day problem, which we know exists.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, too, that even when we talk to a lot of Black folks, irrespective of the United States or here, we tend to talk about the fact that we're overanalyzed, we've overstudied, we've studied this, we've analyzed this.
When people say we've talked enough.
We've talked enough. We have reports on shelves. We have information in books, gathering dust. We've had recommendations. Why are we not just dealing with the current problem that we know exists? Is that a fair assessment of what you're saying?
Sort of, except I think a person sometimes says, we've done all the historical research and now we should be moving ahead. And I'm always thinking, we could move ahead without the historical research. So in a way, it's different.
If you don't know your history, John, if you don't know your history, you're doomed to repeat it. And if we actually sit here and say it's okay to not know our history, then we are complicit in that doom. Oh, you don't think so?
I honestly, with
You don't think we're complicit?
all full respect, we talk about that too much. If we don't know our history, we're doomed to repeat it. Yes, politicians might know some things. Academics might know some things. But, for example, redlining. Redlining was real. My family, probably everybody in my family was redlined in some way or another at some point. Okay. But whatever problems my family has now, any members of my family have now, I could not be moved to say, I'm going to make up a cousin. My cousin Peter, some stuff happened to him. If it was connected to the fact that there wasn't enough equity in the house that he had to live in when he was a little boy, and you could make the argument, I know that what happened to cousin Peter and what would have prevented that would be based on solutions today, not the fact that my Aunt Sis and Uncle Bob lived in an off neighborhood and that's probably the only place they could live. Because the history the history is often something very different from what's going on today, partly because of the progress. And I just think that a lot of it is often we want to make sure white people know that we're good enough and that it isn't our fault. It isn't that there's something wrong with black people, that black people are overrepresented in X, Y, or Z. And my sense of that is those white people might think there's something wrong with us. Let's let a generation go by. Let's fix it. And then their grandkids won't think so, and life is never perfect. I have no interest in showing most of America that we're okay. The only way that you really show you're okay is to get okay. I want to get us okay. I'm beginning to sound like I'm some alderman or something, and I'm not. But this is what I mean. You know, I like history too.
Okay, John, so we're going to agree to disagree on history.
Okay, that's two things.
That's two things. No, I don't think we're agreeing to disagree. I think we're somewhere in the middle of the room, but
We can have a discussion.
we'll need a lot more time, and I think we have
Yeah.
a lot of questions to get to and a lot more. So if we don't center, I want to get back to my original question. If we don't center white supremacy, what do we center? Because on your speech, you said that there were a few things that we can. What would be the things that we start to center? Where do we start to problematize or to look for solutions to some of these problems?
Some of this is language, and that's not the linguist to me. I would say this if I ran a pet store. It's white supremacy, because words sit in the amygdala, however you pronounce that. And if you say white supremacy, you've got your fist in the air, you're thinking of Malcolm X on a t-shirt, you've got this glum expression on your face, it's what white people do. And I don't think that what white people do is the solution to what ails black America today. So what would I do? Phonics, that was a big thing for me. White supremacy, I suppose, but it didn't really work. Vocational education should be stressed. And the eclipse of, thank you for that. And the eclipse of vocational education, I don't know if I would call that white supremacy. It's baked into the whole American fabric that everybody is supposed to go to college after about 1945. There were a lot of things. And then, as you know, I don't like the war on drugs. Now, the war on drugs started partly because of white supremacy. A lot of that was basically going and cleaning out the black, quote unquote, ghettos. But that was in 1967. and all the people who were doing that are dead. And so now I want to get rid of the war on drugs, and I figure that a great many white people are interested in that too. I suppose the war on drugs is a kind of white supremacy, but more important is engaging people in the details of understanding what drug legalization would require and why you would do it, and directing black men in particular into job training programs, et cetera. White supremacy to me is something on the side of all of that. I sense that, I want to say this carefully, what is the attraction of framing it with that term white supremacy for you?
I'm not sure if there's an attraction of framing it in terms of white supremacy for me at all. I think that there is, and from a historical perspective, understanding the history that has perpetuated a legacy where there is poorer health outcomes for black women at childbirth, where there is an over-incarceration of black and indigenous men here in this country as in the United States, where there are situations where policy that has been enacted because of white supremacy has allowed for the disenfranchisement of people of color in terms of building generational wealth. So whereas I won't necessarily say that white supremacy is a part of these problems and tout that as the tagline for my dissertation, what I do know is that it is the underlying philosophy that is part of a lot of the problems that we see in our communities, not just in the United States, but globally. So there is a place for white supremacy. There is a place for having a conversation that centers it, because we know that it has been problematic, and problematic in particular for people that look like me, especially when you look at class, race, and gender. And so that's why I would continue to put it into at least the nucleus of the conversation, if not directly in the center. Is that cool? All right.
Thought experiment. Thought experiment.
This is like between two ferns here, okay?
I tried to put this away. I used this in something I wrote a couple months ago, but I'm going to drag it out here because I thought it was useful. There's this city where in 1700, they only build buildings 2 stories high. And they only do that for some reason, maybe technology, religion, or something, but you can only build it 2 stories high. And that's the way it stayed. There were fewer people then, and so people didn't mind. But as time has gone by, there have been more and more people moving into that city from the surrounding area. There have been people with bigger and bigger families, but they haven't built many buildings taller than 2 stories because of limited resources. So people are just packed into these buildings. You're packed in there. There are too many people in the city, and they're packed into these buildings. And so employment is relatively scarce because people are packed into these buildings. They're not healthy because they're just packed too far into these buildings. There are too many people in the buildings, and there's a rat infestation because of probably the connection between people being packed into the buildings and something like that. You can imagine all the problems there would be in this low-lying city.
Yeah.
So somebody is laying in the hospital, coughing and spitting, and the tradition is to say, oh, look at the poor girl, altitude, it's altitude. And she's sitting there coughing. And really, it's because she has a disease. But because this altitude issue was the original problem that created all these things, nowadays you call everything connected with it altitude. You see a rat running around, oh God, this city suffers from altitude. And it's the rats that are running around. And then someone like me says, aren't we supposed to be calling these things what they are now? And someone says, but we have to understand the history. It's all caused by the fact that we don't build the buildings taller. Does that work for you?
Not at all.
No?
Not at all. Yeah. Talk about oversimplification. Not at all. So
I liked it. It's all the altitude, man.
that was that. That could work for an altitude problem. I'm not sure it works for this problem. I want to talk about your use of language. Let's talk about that for a minute, because we only have a few minutes before we go to Slido. And
The what?
The Slido questions. The audience has questions.
What did you call it?
Slido, isn't it Slido? Yeah.
Okay, all right. No, I've never heard that word.
You yeah.
Well, I didn't read that.
Oh.
Okay.
John,
I didn't know what that
you
was.
Come into our house and like trying to, come on, man. Okay, I
It's
know
the way
what
I
you're
use
doing here.
language.
We have 9 minutes.
Sorry.
I want to talk about. Okay, you're a linguist. You understand language. We have done a lot of time. We've done a lot of talking about white supremacy. Let's push that to the side for a moment. You have entitled your book "Woke Racism." You use the word betray. I'm going to borrow a question that was asked earlier. And you use the word religion. Highly provocative.
Yep.
Why? Why be intentionally provocative with this piece of work right now? Because I understand, like, if I've gotten from our earlier conversations what you want to do, what is really at the heart of, I think, a lot of this discussion that you're having is ensuring that people who need it the most are at the center of these discussions. People who are disenfranchised, who are lower socioeconomic status, people who are suffering are at the center of this discussion. Why intentionally use those words if you know that your book, in the hands of many more people, could help with that problem? Woke, betrayal, religion.
Oh, it was quite deliberate. You're making me think on the outside of it. I usually write books because there's something that I think is swell and I want to share it. But there are a lot of books out there, and you're lucky if a book sells 10,000. That's about how much your book is going to sell if you're a mid-level nonfiction author with a certain footprint. I wrote Woke Racism infuriated. I was sitting on a porch in the summer, fueled with brown liquor, looking at Twitter, and just thinking, I am furious at this condescension that black people are suffering in the wake of what happened to George Floyd, which was a terrible thing. And you know what? I very deliberately wanted the message to really get out. It's the only time I ever wrote a book thinking, because everybody needs to hear this, I need this to sell. And so, yes, the crisp, snappy title, because what I was thinking was this, and this is going to make it sound like it was all about me, when really I was just thinking, how are we going to get this message out that I think lots and lots of black people would agree with? I thought, if somebody in their 20s, like Coleman Hughes, writes this book, which he could, everybody's going to say that he's a baby. If Glenn Lowry, who is 75, writes this book, which he could, I thought everybody's going to say that he's too old. I thought someone needs to write this book here in 2020 who combines two things. One, it has to be somebody in their 40s or 50s where you can't say they're too young, but they're not old yet. Two, I thought it has to be, and this is where I'm not tooting my own horn, it's just a fact. I thought it has to be somebody who has the gift of being able to write fast, because it can't take 3 years because it'll be over. And then we'll be in Vancouver talking about white supremacy. So I thought, I've got to write it really fast. And I thought the only human being on earth who is black and 50-something.
Thank God! Thank God for John! Oh my God!
And who can write it fast. I thought, this has to get out there because nobody else is going to do it. And so, yes, as we talked about in the session, I'm not good at titling my books, but I allowed it to be given that snappy title because I wanted that damn thing to get out there. And it did exactly what I wanted it to. It took 10 years off of my life doing 200 podcast interviews about it. That's not fun for people. And it was work. But I wanted it to sell. Yes, it has a title that makes you want to buy it. Because there are a lot of books out there. Mm-hmm. It wore me to a nub, though. It was work, but it did sell. And by sell, what I mean is lots of people listened and joined the conversation. And my sense is that very few of them didn't get it in the right way. What I hear from people is not God damn all those idiots. I think people understand that I try for nuance in the book. I don't think that it's fueled too much more white supremacy, or at least I don't hear from those people, which I have heard from things I've written before. I wanted to hit a spot. But yeah, that did mean giving it a title that kind of pops. Instead of calling it The Great Divide, nobody would have bought that. So
Well, you did a good job at that. New York Times bestseller.
tried.
And-
It kind of was.
Yeah, very good. So how do we now start? Because I felt sort of at the end of your keynote, there was this, I felt a little deflated. Because you said, sometimes we can't get over the divide. I think a lot of us in this room think that it's necessary to get over a lot of the divide so that we could have actual conversations about innovation and creativity and things that are actually worth talking about instead of things that are dividing and not there. Mm-hmm. So how do we start to really do that?
Sometimes I think we have to realize that getting across the divide is a matter of understanding that we have a difference in basic principles and being able to walk away from that. That's one way I can reach out to you here, in that I know that sounded deflating, but I think you also know that all people can't do what we're doing and not get mad. And so the idea is that in some cases it has to be, you prioritize this, I prioritize that, and there's no common ground here, but maybe we both realize that we're not evil. Even here, though, I'm pushing it because some people are extremely intransigent, but maybe the terms of the discussion have to be understanding that there is this white power battling issue, and that's the point. Not something obscurely called, are you a racist, or something like that, but battling the white power. You hold it in the center. For me, it's one of 8 things. Can we understand that? Can that be the bridge divide? And maybe that's something to expect. Maybe because I've dealt with people like this for so long, maybe I've got a bit of a tripwire sensitivity and I can only imagine them running and walking away and writing about me on Twitter. But maybe that is too pessimistic. I'm open to that. But bridging the divide will not always involve people coming to agree with one another. Sometimes it's understanding the contours of the debate and realizing why you don't agree, and realizing that the disagreement is not because of one side being evil. That is a goal always to be pursued. I hope I didn't sound too much like I don't believe that, even though the truth is that I do find it very difficult to achieve with a certain kind of person.
I think that summary actually helps to, what I often talk about is reconnecting some of those frayed fibers of our humanity that have been lost.
When were they, this is a genuine question, when were they not frayed? Do you sense something really different?
I think in the last little while there has been,
Okay.
and I mean, I'm younger than.
That's okay. I'm 60 in 3 years. Yeah.
Well, I'm 50 next year, so I mean,
That's not that different.
but I'm still younger than you. So for me, I would say that they were never really not frayed. But I think for me, being in politics, talking about race in politics in 2018 before people were woke to talk about it,
right? Yeah.
Right? And being attacked in a way that was unfounded, just made me really.
There's nothing you can say.
Nothing I could say to fix it. There was just nothing, and so it made me sort of really, very, very keenly, acutely aware of the divide that was brewing, if not already existing, and so. That's why I'm saying that this frayed fabric, because I think we have the capacity to do better. Don't say that when I say that we have the capacity to do better.
No, I'm agreeing with you.
Okay. Oh,
No.
That's awesome.
No, the fraying started with
Adam and Eve.
the way the Republicans treated Obama. And social media coming in around that time. 2009 was the year that you started saying, oh, you're not on Twitter. or your mother was on Facebook. Both of those things happened in 2009. And that's when things started coming apart. Twitter becomes default. Kids grow up with phones. Trayvon Martin, Michael Brown, and then woke comes in as a term, and then pandemic, Floyd. Yeah, it's kind of like that. There was something happening in the 2000s to an extent. I know what you mean. It didn't feel as broken.
It didn't
But
feel
then,
as ugly, too. Like
no.
as I don't know, it's toxic. I don't know the word that you're the linguist.
No, toxic,
Yeah.
broken, frayed, hopeless, difficult, acrid.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I didn't say all, don't say all the words.
That was every word.
So I'm just going to say one thing before I get into the Slido. I was actually, it's a Slido. Slido.
I have never heard
I
that
keep
term.
looking at it. I have to say one thing before we get into Slido, and that is that I usually wear these very provocative T-shirts when I go to events. And if I'd known more specifically that we would have this conversation, I would have worn my Stay Woke shirt. Shout out to Mark Starter. Okay, so Slido questions. Keep them coming, but the first question that we have from the audience, and they're all anonymous for some reason, the Black Student Union at UBC. Don't look up there, don't worry.
It's that word. Anyway, go ahead.
The Black Student Union at UBC is calling for dedicated spaces for Black students on campus. What are your thoughts on such race-based affinity spaces?
All right, I'm going to say it. I think that is based on a melodramatically exaggerated sense of what racism consists of, especially at a school in Vancouver. I see no reason why Black students at this school would need a dedicated space where they could feel more comfortable that they do not already have. And if I were a provost here, that is what I would say. I don't get it at all. I think that's based on it's based on exactly what I said up there about thinking of victimization as what makes you most interesting. And for somebody to feel that way at 19, they are to be instructed out of it. And I'm sorry to anyone out there if that feels directly challenging, but that is the way I feel.
So the challenge of that, though, is in some of these spaces where you come in and you're the only one or one of very few in that space, and you could have a space where you could collectively laugh out loud, commiserate with each other, talk about, where am I going to get my hair braided or my hair have that space. Why is that problematic?
Because you don't need it.
Why?
Because you can go hang out somewhere. The idea that there is a dedicated space where you're holding yourself off from all these white people who make you feel so bad, 1960, yeah. Not today. It's an exaggeration. There doesn't need to be a dedicated space. The way things happen is that students of different groups, often informally, will find that there's a certain place they like to be, and pretty much people start to understand it. I don't see why there needs to be a dedicated space. Yes, you do want to talk about, for example, where you're going to get your hair cut. I remember that very much. And so I would be hanging out with some Black guys and say where to get my hair cut. And I wouldn't feel that I would have been more comfortable asking that on one floor of a particular dormitory as opposed to in the cafeteria while various white people might hear me asking. No, and I spent my whole time when I was that age often the only Black person in the room. It still happens even now. It's not optimal, but it's nothing that would require that kind of dedicated space. Now, theme houses, I get. That's something. But the idea that there need to be these cordoned off safe spaces where white people are told they can't be, no, I do not agree with that.
I think, next question. I think many of us have benefited from examining our actions and motives through the lens of unconscious bias. When does this become pernicious?
When does it become what?
Pernicious, sorry.
In 2020. I mean, I think that it is a very important thing to always examine yourself for the bias, but for the idea to be that you're always going to find it, and that it's a bias of a kind that means that you should then go out and subject black people to different standards, that's where I think it morphs into performance. And that's where I get mad and drink and write books. But unconscious bias is real. That's what I mean about the 70s and the 80s and people thinking about that. I think that's mature to examine yourself for that, but it can be taken too far. You don't think so?
You know, I had a question about that 70s and 80s, because if they were doing reflection on 70s and 80s, in the 70s and 80s within themselves, as you've said, were they also doing the reflection within policy?
Yeah.
You sure?
Uh-huh. Like there was the, nobody ever talks about this, I guess because it didn't work, but the Community Reinvestment Act of 1974 forced banks to lend in depressed neighborhoods, which was an attempt to help with the redlining that had been abolished officially 6 or 7 years ago. And that was created by a very, very white senator. And the idea was to make up for the wrongs of the past. And it was based on this idea that America was racist even if there wasn't something like official redlining. Things like that happen. Some things work and some don't. I mean, it's never a magic bullet. But yeah, I think there were results of that examination. My mother did that. My mother was a social work teacher, and she was very much into showing white people that they were racist and didn't know it. She was part of that vanguard. That was part of her classes. I watched her do it socially. She sometimes enjoyed it a little too much, I think, but she was right. She was showing people that just because you liked Dr. King doesn't mean that you don't still have bigotry inside of you. I thought that was an important lesson.
Okay, we're going to start going through these questions faster. Do you find that this way of thinking helps build allyship, especially with white fragility?
What?
Yeah, this question, I'm not, is it related to the last question? I don't know.
I don't get that one.
Yeah, sorry, that one's going to have to go. Whoever asked it. That one's gone. Okay. How will we stop the power of hyper woke people calling you racist without destroying the meaning of the word racist when it is actually appropriately used?
It's very important to realize that we won't stop the hyper woke from calling you racist. We have to learn to withstand it and understand that they're saying it doesn't mean that we are in any significant sense. And yes, the word racist should mean what it means. That's why I get a little itchy calling a society racist, although I understand the extension. But yeah, there are racists, there is racism, there is subtle racism, but it's not racist to disagree with a black person about something. That's got to stop.
Does this fixation on race overshadow serious conversations that need to happen about class? Something the communism-phobic USA is resistant to.
If you roll the tape backwards, we would talk much more about class, but it doesn't work in America very quickly. The 90s British sitcom, probably shown more here than in the United States, Keeping Up Appearances with Patricia Routledge, was all about class jokes. Huge hit in Britain. You would think that there would have been an American version of it because there are American versions of all the 70s and 80s Britcoms that were hits. But it was never done in America because it wouldn't make any sense. We don't find class interesting, and we tend to pretend class doesn't exist in America, so there couldn't be that sitcom. That's America. For us, it's all about what color you are.
Right. Do you have solutions for police violence on black people that is not addressing anti-black systemic racism?
My solution is to make it so that black people don't meet cops much. And that's why I am against the war on drugs. That's one of many reasons. But reforming the cops is going to be tough, as we saw recently with what 5 black cops did. And so my solution is, yes, we need to talk about cop reform, but look about how, this is important. Since 2020, you have to think about results. The body cameras, you've got cameras up in the clouds recording all these things. Not a thing has changed. Every 4 months, there's some horrific thing that happens to what we hear in the media is a black man, but if you look at databases, it's also happening to white men. The cops are a scourge. And so my solution is let's keep the cops away from black people as much as possible. And a lot of what creates these encounters is often tied ultimately in a kind of a mousetrap style to the war on drugs and cops being drawn to poor neighborhoods, and then other things start to happen. So that's my sense of that. No?
Well, it started with redlining.
Yes, it started with redlining.
All
That's the
right.
history.
We're agreeing. We're agreeing on that. We're agreeing on that. We're agreeing on that. And
Yeah.
and investments in programs looking at other ways of dealing with issues, addiction issues, mental health issues,
Yes.
et cetera.
Yeah, the cops can't be social workers.
Right.
Yeah, and that often gets people killed. Right.
We could agree on that too. Look what the questions
That
are
was an
doing.
agreement,
All
yeah.
right. If most people are still too afraid to push back on the elect, and that's in
Somebody used the term.
Yes,
okay,
somebody
yeah.
did. There you go.
Yeah.
Got another one for you, another
Well,
point
that
for you.
felt good.
How will we ever reverse woke racism? When do you think the tide will shift, and how?
I don't have the answer to that question just 3 years later, but I suspect that there's a pushback in general society against the excesses of this sort of thing. But I worry about academia. You have to look at the dog that didn't bark, so to speak. And so, for example, before Christmas, this goofy chancellor at one of the branches of Purdue University made what he thought was a joke by getting up and imitating a Chinese person saying something. One sentence, dumb joke, socially inept man. Now, racist joke, yeah, but it was just that one thing. He still has his job. They were calling for his head. His life is supposed to be over because of a half second something he did. That wouldn't have been fair. He still has it. Watch, they fired him today. But last I checked, he still has his job, and he should still have his job. It should take much more than that to lose your entire life. That's something. A year ago, he would have been sent to the planet Jupiter that afternoon. And so I have some hope, but it's going to take a while.
Okay. So you know a lot about language in public discourse. Can we give students tools to use language to engage instead of to label or distance? Can this be taught?
That's not the kind of linguistics I happen to do, and so I lack the expertise. But I can definitely say this. If you're trying to convince someone of something, and this I have to tread very lightly here, because the way people speak colloquially is always a wonderful and much more complex thing than we think. If you're trying to convince somebody of something, although the word like is very grammatically complex and whole books have been written about it and how it works, if you use the word like every 4 words, you don't sound like you mean what you're saying, and you need to learn how to use it maybe every 15. Not too much like if you're trying to convince somebody of something. Also, if you are making a long point, it's very useful to think in terms of 3. You have 3 points you're going to make them and get off. Don't trail off, just say this, say that, and then go down at the end of your sentence and go off. That's a way of being convincing rather than it seeming like you're just kind of spraying out sentences the way we all do when we're speaking casually. But those are just things I know about giving a talk. I think this person wants something more sophisticated, and I lack the chops because I'm not a specialist in rhetoric. And so that was a very long way of saying I don't know.
Okay, next question. Do you disbelieve?
Yes.
Disbelieve. Child. In generational trauma? And, do you disbelieve that generational trauma has an effect on people today?
I don't want to talk about that because obviously there is generational trauma in terms of what's passed on in a family based on the past. But I think that the norm with human beings is that you get beyond that sort of thing. That's the norm. Something terrible happened to my father or my mother. I today have 2.5 kids and am doing ultrasounds, and I have a side business where I make cotton candy, or I don't know what they make, but something like that. That's what human beings do. Human beings are resilient. One of the most interesting studies I once read for no reason was men who had seen horrible things in World War II, as often as not, had no PTSD. They didn't talk about it. They got on with their lives. That's normal. It wasn't some great effort. We're more resilient than we think. And if we talk too much about generational trauma, it's good to know about it. But I worry that people are going to use it as, this is one more way that we're victims. My grandmother went through this, and here I am living in Cleveland in a nice suburb, but I still suffer because of what my grandmother went through. I think people are going to abuse it, and maybe that's just me getting too oversensitive.
Okay, so we won't bring epigenetics into that conversation.
Now, there's something to epigenetics, but once again, I don't want to make too much of even the biological aspect.
I understand. I understand the point that you're making there, but I think, yeah, okay.
I know what you mean, too.
Yeah, okay.
We agreed.
We agree on that, too, yeah. Is there a danger, this question, is there a danger your message is too nuanced as to be understood and may offer folks like Ron DeSantis a basis for his policies? Please, let's just think about this question because it is a good one.
No. People have been asking me that now for 25 years, whether I'm too nuanced and therefore evil conservative white Republicans might use my material as the basis for what they do. And the answer is some of them do to an extent. It's inevitable. Life is not perfect. But I think that my work more gets across to reasonably minded, middle of the road people who I'm trying to reach. And especially over about the past 5 or 6 years, I've been very explicit that I'm not interested in communicating with or stirring up that base. And so in the book, Woke Racism, in the very beginning, I say, Fox News watching Republicans are welcome to sit in on this book, but that's not the audience that I'm looking for. I had it in my contract that I would not do Hannity or anything like that, even though it would have made the book sell even better. I did Megyn Kelly, that's the closest I got, but that, but I didn't do any of the others. I did, but none of the other ones. And even today, I think the piece that I have in the Times is me saying something about critical race theory, but explicitly saying that Ron DeSantis is an idiot and would never get my vote, et cetera. So I think it's pretty clear. I know what people mean by that. Yeah. I try to be explicit. There's always going to be some leak, but I think that my main audience is not that crowd. I insult them a lot. I diss them a lot, and they don't like it.
But I think, too, they'll draw pieces from it because the medium is the message. You filter anything through a medium, they'll pull out what they want and take what they want and run with it.
But
that can't be your responsibility. I'm going to keep going. Why do you think the issue of socioeconomics is excluded from the lexicon of wokeism?
Because is socioeconomics here a shorthand for culture? Like what
I don't
they
think
mean?
so. I think it's maybe a shorthand for lower middle class.
Oh, I see. Well, I think
That's the way I interpreted it.
It's often said that affirmative action should be revised to be based on socioeconomics. I think that's just true. It shouldn't be based on skin color anymore. Mm-hmm. But the thing is, if you base it on that, you're not showing that you know that racism exists. And so there's a sense that it's supposed to be about skin color, even if we're talking about black people who suffered no disadvantage. And yes, that black person who suffered no disadvantage may have suffered some sort of usually oblique racist discrimination here and there. But does that justify a special set-aside policy in school? And I think the answer is no. But if you reduce it to socioeconomics, I remember Shelby Steele, the conservative black writer, has a passage in one of his books where he says that he tried to make that argument about socioeconomics, and one person, a black woman, stood up and said, but Shelby, if we make it about socioeconomics, black kids lose their privilege. And then she corrected herself and she said something else. But what she meant was that being treated in that way, there being that kind of lowered standard in acknowledgement to racism, is, for I think some people, part of what makes blackness interesting. And you don't want to get away from that by making it about socioeconomics, even though there's so many poor white people. So yeah, I think that's the reason. But that needs to change. There needs to be affirmative action based on how people came up. But that should no longer be, frankly, about my kids. It shouldn't have been about me, and that was in the 80s. Even that was too late. I would say it shouldn't be about you. It's just, the country has changed.
For sure. Last question. Few people actually use Twitter and are live in the conflicts they're in. I use Twitter. Is this culture war a worthwhile use of the ivory tower's mental resources?
The issue is that this culture war should be about getting out into the real world and helping people who don't use Twitter. And to the extent that it isn't, you know, I got into Twitter a certain amount during the pandemic because I was bored, but I gradually started to realize this is a tiny little bubble, and my Twitter now is quite dull. I have to remember to even put my own stuff on it because it's not the world. I lurk. I look at what other people are putting on it, but I don't put much onto it. Yeah, it's not the world. We tend to forget that we are very rarefied people in that way.
Dr. John McWhorter, thank you so much.
Thank you, Celina.
For an absolutely fascinating conversation.
Thank you, everybody.
I would also like to thank Phil Lind for making this possible. And a big thank you to our wonderful team of volunteers and staff members, Gregor, Becca, Kara, Laiza, at the School of Public Policy and Global Affairs, and the Alumni and Development Office, who worked tirelessly to make this series happen. Your hard work, your dedication is absolutely appreciated. Yes. And last but not least, I want to thank you, our audience, those who are in person, those of you who stayed online, my family too. Hi, guys. We hope that you've enjoyed this event and that it has offered you a new lens on uncivil discourse. Please follow us or visit our website for more details. I hope it's up there somewhere. On upcoming events with Dr. Sophia Noble, Linda Greenhouse, and Dr. Jonathan Haidt. You are welcome to use the QR code that is up on the screen to register right away for the next event on March 2nd with Dr. Sophia Noble. And I wish to thank everyone for being here this evening, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Please get home safe, be well, stay safe, and have an absolutely fantastic night. Thank you.